Virginia came to Columbus, Mississippi. And we're just pleased as we can be to have you down here in our area. He teaches part-time at East Mississippi Community College. He's a member of the SCV, friend of the Tip of Tigers. Y'all welcome Dr. Brandon Beck. Well, this is my fourth time to be here, and I thought this time I would introduce you, take 30 minutes to introduce you to some rock-solid citizens of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's Army. My previous times with you all, I've talked about Forrest, Earl Van Dorn, CSS Arkansas, but I thought I'd go back to where I cut my teeth as a historian with the Army of Northern Virginia. Cullen Andrews' battle and his regiment, the 3rd Alabama Infantry, they were, as I say, rock-solid citizens of the Army of Northern Virginia. Robert E. Lee, he said 4 very memorable things about the Army he commanded. At Appomattox, day of surrender, I know you all know that he said about the Army of Northern Virginia that after 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to lay down in the face been compelled to yield in the face of overwhelming numbers and resources. During the war, he said some things that apply so perfectly to battle in the 3rd Alabama. In 1863, Lee said of his men, "There never were such men in an army before. They will accomplish anything if properly led." And that was certainly true of his army. The Army of Northern Virginia was the next thing to invincible in the war. It took overwhelming numbers of resources to bring the Army of Northern Virginia down. It was the only Confederate Army, and it represented every state in the Confederacy. It was the only Confederate Army that had a realistic chance of winning the war. And Lee, of course, was right to say that there never were such men in an army before. In 1864, he said, "Our soldiers are not an army. Our soldiers are citizens defending their country." And again, he had his army exactly right. This was an army of citizen soldiers. No professional soldiers, no born soldiers, but citizen soldiers defending their country. After the war, after Appomattox, Lee became president of broken down little Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. And during the 5 years that he lived and served as president of that institution, he made it his practice as president of the college to meet individually with every one of his students during the course of the semester. And during one such interview, talking to an older student who had served in the Army of Northern Virginia, that student made a thoughtless kind of reference or statement to the effect that he was behind in his academic program because of, quote, "all the time I wasted in the Confederate Army." And Lee stood up. Lee seldom lost his temper, but stood up and said words to the effect that this was an army of citizens. There never were such men in the army before, and young man, you did not waste your time in the Army of Northern Virginia. He could have said, he was speaking about the entire army, but he couldn't have directed all of these words to Cullen Battle and the 3rd Alabama. Cullen Battle was born in 1829. He was Virginian by descent. He was born in Georgia. He was an Alabama citizen. He was a lawyer. He was not a rich man. He owned no slaves, but he was adamantly in favor of secession. Unlike his father, who was a very rich man and owned many slaves, his father was against secession. His father believed that the future of the institution was safer in the Union than in the Confederacy. Battle had no military training of any kind until 1859, when, like so many men across the South, when the news of John Brown's raid, the terrorist raid on Harper's Ferry in the fall of 1859 came south, many Southern men organized militia companies that became the nucleus or the core of later regiments in Confederate service. And the company that Cullen Battle organized became the nucleus of the 3rd Alabama. He was elected its lieutenant colonel. The 3rd Alabama was the very first regiment from the Deep South to reach Richmond, Virginia. It served the whole year in Lee's army, and it reached Virginia earlier than any other regiment from the Deep South. It saw action for the first time at Seven Pines on the last day of May and the first day of June, 1862. The regiment's colonel was killed in that battle. Seven Pines for the Army of Northern Virginia was very much like Shiloh for our Army. It was the baptism of fire for most of these men. Very few men served at Manassas. That was a small battle. Seven Pines, like Shiloh, was a big battle, and it was the first battle in Virginia that was going to be very much like the rest of the battles in the state's history, just as Shiloh was for the war in our part of the country. For the Seven Pines, the roll call of major battles that General Battle and his 3rd Alabama served in with the Army of Northern Virginia, it is that there would not have been room for all of these battles on the Army, on the 3rd Alabama's battle flag. There would not have been room for all the streamers and names. Seven Pines, Malvern Hill, South Mountain in Maryland, Sharpsburg in Maryland, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Monocacy in Maryland, Cool Spring back in Virginia, 3 terrible defeats in 1864, Winchester, Fisher's Hill, and Cedar Creek, and then finally the fight just before the surrender at Appomattox. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to take you through the handout that I distributed, because there are a couple of things in it that I want you to come back to. The first page is the only photograph of General Battle known to exist. The second page is an artist's depiction of typical members of the 3rd Alabama. The 3rd and 4th pages are a short biography of the general written by Robert Crick, who at the time he wrote this was the chief historian at the Fredericksburg Chancellorsville National Park Service battlefield site. Battle was not a rich man, I said, but he was very well connected. He was close personal friends with the wartime governor of Alabama, but Crick seems to hold it against Battle that Battle tried to use his connections to achieve promotions. I think it was an entirely natural thing to do, to try to win promotion by asking for letters of reference. And he certainly deserved the 2 promotions that he received. At Seven Pines, when Colonel Lomax was killed, Battle was promoted to the rank of Colonel of the 3rd Alabama, and he commanded the 3rd Alabama either in of itself or as part of a larger brigade for the rest of the war. At the Battle of Gettysburg, Battle was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General, which is the rank where he finished the war. He commanded an all-Alabama brigade for the rest of the war. The map is something I want to come back to in just a second. And I want to relate personal experience to you from the map. And it has to do also with the second to last page, the dedication. This is a copy of the flyer that the National Park Service put out when they dedicated a marker at the Bloody Lane of Sharpsburg to the Alabama Brigade. Rhodes Battle commanded only a regiment in that brigade at that point. And then the last page is something that the University of Alabama put out when they published my book about the general. I probably shouldn't even say my book, because I brought some copies in case anybody is interested. But shortly before he died, Battle died in 1905. Shortly before he died, he dictated, I think, to his son, Henry Battle. He dictated a memoir. Henry Battle typed it as his father dictated it. And it was his war memoir, but in a way very disappointingly, it was completely about the men that served in his regiment rather than about itself. He was modest to a fault. He never mentioned, for example, the fact that he was wounded 5 times in the course of the war. He wrote exclusively about his men, his boys, as he called them. And he entitled the memoir, 3rd Alabama. And he put an exclamation mark after Alabama. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. I was doing research on a book a long time ago now that I wrote about the 3rd Battle of Winchester. It was the biggest and the bloodiest of all the battles in the Shenandoah Valley. Battles regiment played a major part in the battle. And I found a reference to that memoir, 3rd Alabama. It had never been published. I went to Montgomery, I went to the Alabama Department of Archives and History and found it there. I found it lying on a shelf, typed, ready to go. I used it to, it was a great help to me in doing my research. When the book was done, when that book was done, I made a proposal to the University of Alabama. I said that I think that this memoir ought to be published. I think somebody in Virginia, me, ought to do it because that's where General Battle served. And I think that the University of Alabama ought to publish it since it's an all-Alabama book. And they agreed. We only disagreed on one thing. They wanted, I felt like when I was going to edit this memoir, what I needed to do was to write an introduction to each chapter and then identify in footnotes all of the men and places that Battle mentioned. People in Alabama would know, but readers elsewhere might not. They agreed that I should do that, but they wanted to put the notes at the back of the book because that saves publishers a lot of money. We have all the footnotes not at the foot of the page where they belong, but in the back of the book. I wanted the footnotes at the bottom of the page so that when you're reading, you go to the note that's right there, you don't thumb back to the back of the book and lose your place and go through all of that rigmarole just to get a point of information. They agreed to that, so we had a deal, and they published the book in the year 2000. The book, I think, shows exactly what kind of man Battle was. First of all, he was modest to a fault, I think. Secondly, he was a very emotional man, very sentimental man, very romantic man. His heart bled for Virginia and the sufferings of Virginia civilians. He knew that citizens in Alabama would meet the same fate, that his heart bled for them. At the same time, his heart would swell with pride when he recalled Lee's orders to Confederate soldiers in Maryland and Pennsylvania as to how they were to conduct themselves as far as private citizens were concerned. And the way the Confederate soldiers obeyed those orders, he thought, was not only a testimony to Robert E. Lee, it was a testimony to the entire spirit of the Army of Northern Virginia. He was historically minded. He believed that a knowledge of history was the essence of education, and even more than that, he believed that a knowledge of history was the essence of good citizenship. And these are citizen soldiers. He loved animals. The 3rd Alabama had a dog named Collins, and he had 2 horses. A couple of funny stories about them. One horse named Frank, and the other one named Prince. He was very fond of animals and loved those animals. And finally, he was absolutely 100% devoted to the cause of Southern independence. He gave it every single thing he had. Without claiming any credit, again, he was modest to a fault. He never met Jefferson Davis, but if he had met Jefferson Davis, I think Davis so often judged men by the depth of their commitment to Southern independence. Sometimes he was led astray in that. But if Davis had met Battle, I think he'd have appointed him, he would have promoted him to lieutenant general on the spot. Because there was nobody more dedicated in spirit to the cause of Southern independence than Cullen Battle. And you can see it in his pages written many years after the war. What kind of men did he command? Well, here are some things that Battle singled out as far as his men were concerned. First, he was proud of the fact that they were glad to be the 1st Regiment up from the Deep South to reach Virginia. It wasn't just the result of orders. They were glad to have been so ordered to arrive ahead of anybody else. Second, he was proud of the way they handled themselves in their first combat at 7 Pines on the 1st of June, 1862. 7 Pines was, Lee wasn't in command at that point. 7 Pines was a badly managed, uncoordinated mess in which a lot of men lost their lives unnecessarily. That old military term, snafu, situation normal, all fouled up. 7 times is a good example of that. There's a lot of unnecessary stuff. Third, Malvern Hill, the battle immediately following, was even worse. Malvern Hill was almost more like a massacre than it was a battle. And no regiment in the Army lost more men that day than the 3rd Alabama. Their spirit was unquenchable and their morale stayed high. The 3rd Alabama got burial duty at Malvern Hill and so missed the Battle of Second Manassas. But as you may remember, after Second Manassas, General Lee decided to take the Army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac River into Maryland. And 3rd Alabama was reunited with the Army by that time, the 3rd of September, 1862. The 3rd Alabama was the first regiment to cross the Potomac. The men had their rifles and powder boxes held over their heads as they waded across at White's Ford. And as they came across, and especially as they filed into column on the Maryland side and resumed their march, they were chanting, 3rd Alabama, 3rd Alabama. And that's where the exclamation point came in the title that he chose for the memoir. The fighting at South Mountain was the most ferocious fighting that they would see during the war on the 15th of September. Battle explains how the regiment had to change fronts, change direction of fire no less than 5 times during the course of a 3-hour battle against heavy odds. Battle was wounded at South Mountain and so missed the day in American history when more lives were lost than any other day in American history, the 17th of September at Sharpsburg, the battle Yankees called the Battle of Antietam. Is in fact the Battle of Sharpsburg. And more Americans were killed that day than on any other day in the history of the United States. And I'd like you, if you would, turn to look at Sharpsburg just a little more closely. If you could turn back to the map that's in the handout. And if you can find the Confederate line of battle, which begins about halfway up the page on the left with the name Colquitt, and then the line runs straight. This is the line of the sunken road, which comes to be called Bloody Lane, which runs straight to this turning point and then drops a little bit and runs to where the National Park Service Observation Tower is found today. Rhodes, Alabama Brigade, well, you can see the regimental designations above the name Alabama, the 26th, the 12th, the 3rd, that's battle, the 5th, and the 6th. Where the 6th Alabama butted up against the 2nd North Carolina is where the Yankees broke through at the sunken road and turned the sunken road into the Bloody Lane. They broke in there and sent the fire down the length of the North Carolina regiments fronting in the lane. The Alabamans got away. The Alabamans missed the worst of it. It was a terrible massacre for those North Carolina troops in that lane, and they are still there. They are still buried in the lane. In September 2001, if you turn the page, September 2001, I got a call from Ted Alexander, the chief park historian at Sharpsburg, who told me that sometime in the 1950s, someone had made off with the marker designating the location of those Alabama regiments, and they wanted to replace that marker. And my book had just come out, and he thought that I might be interested in being the speaker at that dedication, and of course I was. And it was scheduled for the 17th of September of 2001. And of course, that is 9/17, just a few days after 9/11. They decided to go ahead with the ceremony, and I'm reminded all the time of the great Mississippi novelist William Faulkner's statement that the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. This came home to me so strongly that day as I drove up from Winchester to Sharpsburg. As I drove north, and it's not but an hour or so, as I drove north, I left Winchester about noon, just as the memorial service in the National Cathedral for 9/11 was getting underway. About the time I got to Sharpsburg and pulled into that parking area behind the bloody lane on the battlefield, the service in the National Cathedral ended, and that great National Cathedral bell began to boom. And I don't know how many times they tolled that bell, but that booming came across the radio as I sat in the truck, right there where I was supposed to be. I was a few minutes early. And I couldn't even think about getting out of the truck with that bell tolling. The bell finally stopped, and the broadcast went off. And I got out, and as I stepped in the parking lot, there was a bell still tolling. There was a bell still tolling. And it was a church bell in little town of Sharpsburg right there in the battlefield, picked up where the National Cathedral bell left off. I don't remember much about what I said at that dedication. Everything was in a kind of fog from that point on. That was a moving experience to go from the most bloody day in American history, 9/17/62, in the sound range of the first bloody day in American history, 9/11/01. I do remember that the governor of Alabama was there. He was there. I don't know whether he came up from Montgomery or whether he happened to be in D.C., but he came up as himself. He didn't come as governor. There were no photographers. There was no entourage. He just thought enough of these Alabama boys to make that trip. And we stood next to each other at the lectern. He said a few words. I thought typically he'd go on forever and ever, but he said very few things, and was just proud to be there as I was. Well, battle was not at Sharpsburg. He had been wounded at South Mountain, and so missed that. But he was at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and then at Gettysburg. It was at Gettysburg that he had his finest day as a general. He was promoted not on the field, but very soon after the battle, he was promoted to the command of the All-Alabama Brigade. It was his greatest day as an officer in the field. But he put more weight, he put more credence on this day. In late February of 1864, with the Army of Northern Virginia in winter quarters south of the Rapidan, waiting for Grant to move in the spring, this titanic confrontation that's going to take place in the spring of 1864. A lot of the men's enlistments were coming up. A lot of the men were due to muster out after 2 years. This was a crisis because the men were entirely within their rights, and no legislation had been passed to compel them to stay in. The 3rd Alabama was the first regiment in the Army to voluntarily re-enlist for duration, and that just won Cullen Battle's heart. His men were willing to do that. The regiment received the thanks of the Confederate Congress and received the personal thanks and salutation of Robert E. Lee himself. I found a letter from an Alabama soldier written at this time. Now, he was not in the 3rd Alabama. I have to say he was not in the 3rd Alabama, but I believe he was in Battle Brigade. And what he wrote home about that incident, I think, just needs to be said. He wrote on the 20th of February, 1864, quote, "We are willing to fight on, even if we do not get anything but bread. We will fight on so long as we are able to strike a deadly blow at the foe. Has not enough of our sunny South been devastated? Are there not enough widows and fatherless children? May we be let alone is all we ask." In the late summer what battle went through. The regiment went through the Battle of the Wilderness, the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. They fought the Mule Shoe salient there, and the battle lasted 10 days, between 10 days and 2 weeks. At which point, the Second Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, and that was Battles Corps, was pulled out and sent to the Shenandoah Valley, as Robert E. Lee attempted in 1864 to revive Stonewall Jackson's diversionary strategy of 1862. Didn't work so well. Didn't pan out this time. The odds were too long against it. But there were some hard-fought battles, but they ended with the defeat at the Third Battle of Winchester, and then the defeat at Cedar Creek. At Winchester, General Rhodes, commanding the division, was killed, and Battle was placed in command. At the moment when his regiment had launched a counterattack, now the Confederates are fighting 14,000 against 41,000, but at this moment in the battle, the 3rd Alabama had launched a counterattack that came that close to splitting the Yankee army in two. When Rhodes was killed, Jubal Early, who was in command, put Battle in command of the division, but halted the attack. And Battle thought that a terrible mistake had been made. Exactly a month later, the same situation almost occurred. A very similar situation occurred, but at this point, on the 19th of October, 1864, Battle took a terrible wound in the knee. His left knee was shattered by a mini ball. The doctors wanted to amputate on the field, but Battle refused to undergo amputation. He was invalided out. That was the war. That was the war for him. He finished the war at home in Alabama, although the regiment went on to the very bitter end at Alabama. This 3rd Alabama, they were not glamorous and they were not spectacular. This is not the Stonewall Brigade, it's not the Louisiana Tigers, it's not the 6th Mississippi, it's not Booth's Texans, it's not some of the other famous regiments that we're all familiar with. But they were solid, you might almost say blue-collar citizens of the Army that most typified the Southern Confederacy. When Battle died in 1905, his son, Henry, was at that time a pastor at the Blandford Church in Petersburg, Virginia. And Battle, who had fallen in love with Virginia during the war, I mentioned to you that his heart bled for Virginia. Battle wanted to be buried in Virginia. And his son arranged with the A.P. Hill camp of what was then the UCV, United Confederate Veterans. His son arranged with the UCV that the father's body would be brought from Greensboro, North Carolina, where he'd been editor of the paper. His body would be brought from Greensboro to Petersburg. The A.P. Hill camp of the United Confederate Veterans would meet the train at the Petersburg depot, and there would be a cortege that would go to the Blandford Cemetery, where he was buried on the 12th of April in 1905 under a simple, ordinary headstone that every Confederate soldier, many, a typical Confederate headstone, marks the grave of General Battle. He was buried 44 years to the day that the firing on Fort Sumter occurred. Thank you very much.